You think prices went up because of stimulus checks and money printing. That's the story you were told. And it isn't wrong exactly. It's just incomplete. Here's what nobody explained clearly. The global economy of 2026 isn't a stretched, overheated version of the one you grew up in. It's a different machine, built on different assumptions. And the 30-year discount that kept your groceries, your electronics, and your car payment artificially cheap has been permanently switched off. Not paused. Not correcting itself back to normal next quarter. Switched off. You're not imagining that everything costs more and takes longer to show up. You're watching the final phase of a 40-year experiment quietly fail in real time. And this isn't really a story about tariffs and factories, even though it looks like one on the surface. It's a story about geopolitics and empire, told through spreadsheets and shipping manifests instead of armies. And if you know your history of economic crisis, you already suspect exactly where a story like this tends to end. Here's a question worth sitting with before we go any further. What if the cheap decade wasn't the normal one? What if 1995 through 2015 was the anomaly? A strange brief window where you could build a phone from parts in 12 countries, and nobody with an army cared enough to stop you. And what we're living through now is actually the more typical state of the world reasserting itself. For 30 years, the operating rule of the global economy was simple. Whatever could be made somewhere cheaper would be. That rule is dead. In its place, 6 separate fractures are splitting the global economy into rival camps, and every single one of them pushes prices in the same direction. Up. We're going to walk through all 6. But on one of them, the one politicians love to put on a press release with a shovel and a hard hat, we're not going to just describe it the way everyone else does. We're going to audit it. Real numbers, real factories, real jobs, or the conspicuous absence of them. Let's break it down, fracture by fracture. Just in time becomes just in case. 1. The insurance policy nobody wanted to pay for. Picture a hospital blood bank. For decades, administrators ran it lean. Store the bare minimum, order what's needed, trust the supplier to restock every few days. It's efficient. It's also fine, right up until the delivery truck can't get through. Then efficient quietly becomes unprepared. That is the exact trade-off the entire global economy made for 30 years. Just at industrial scale, and it had a name. Just-in-time manufacturing. 0 warehouses, 0 buffer stock. Parts arriving hours, not weeks, before they were needed. It was a masterpiece of efficiency, and it worked perfectly under one condition, that nothing, anywhere, ever went wrong. Then the 2020s happened. You already know the pandemic broke the model once. Here's the part most explainers skip. It's still breaking, on a rolling basis, in ways that rarely make the evening news for more than a day. Take the Suez Canal, a route that historically carried roughly 1 in every 8 tons of the world's maritime trade. Since late 2023, container traffic has been rerouted away from it in response to Red Sea shipping security disruptions, and the numbers haven't recovered. As of early 2026, weekly transit volumes through the canal were still running about 60% below pre-crisis levels, with vessels diverting around the Cape of Good Hope and adding 10 to 14 days to an Asia-Europe voyage. 10 to 14 days doesn't sound catastrophic until you remember that just-in-time manufacturing was engineered on the assumption that number was 0. So what replaced it? Just in case. Picture a different room now, not a hospital, a boardroom. For 40 years, the chief financial officer's entire job was to make that number in the inventory line item as small as possible, because unused stock sitting in a warehouse is money that isn't earning anything. Now imagine that same CFO in 2026. The instructions from the board have flipped completely. Stop optimizing for the smallest possible number. Start optimizing for the ability to survive a bad Tuesday. Build the second warehouse. Sign the second supplier contract with a country that isn't a geopolitical rival, even if their unit costs are 12% higher. Bring the factory home if you can afford it, or move it to a friendly neighbor if you can't. All of it costs money. Holding inventory costs money. Building a new plant in Ohio instead of expanding one in Guangdong costs money. Paying wages in Arizona instead of Vietnam costs money. And that bill doesn't stay on a corporate balance sheet, quietly absorbed by a shareholder somewhere. It gets passed forward, line by line, until it lands on yours, at the checkout line. Here's the part that should really land. This isn't a temporary adjustment while everyone finds their footing. Resilience is a permanent operating cost. The same way an insurance premium is a permanent operating cost. Nobody buys homeowners insurance for 1 year, decides their house never burned down, and cancels it feeling ripped off. You keep paying it, forever, because the alternative is catastrophic and unpredictable. That's exactly the trade every major economy just made with its supply chains. And it means the reshoring premium you're paying on manufactured goods isn't a bubble waiting to pop. It's the new floor. Efficiency used to be the whole point of the global economy. Now it's the thing everyone is deliberately, expensively, walking away from. The trade war's secret weapon. 2. The chokehold nobody saw coming, from either direction. Here's a fact that surprises most people. The United States isn't the only country that figured out you can weaponize a supply chain instead of an army. China did too, and it's been doing it methodically since 2023. Beijing controls roughly 80% of the world's refined gallium and 60% of its germanium, two minerals with no easy substitute in semiconductors, fiber optics, and defense electronics. If you've never heard of either one, that's the point. Nobody weaponizes the ingredient everybody's watching. You weaponize the boring one nobody bothered to stockpile. Starting in mid-2023, Beijing began requiring export licenses for both minerals, timed alongside Washington's own chip restrictions. By December 2024, licensing had escalated to an outright ban on sales of gallium, germanium, and antimony to the United States. In October 2025, China went further still, introducing a rule requiring a license for any product manufactured anywhere in the world if it contains more than 0.1% of Chinese-origin rare earth material, a rule modeled closely on America's own long-arm export controls, aimed right back at Washington. Read that again. A rule that reaches into a factory in Germany, or Vietnam, or Mexico, and asks, how much of you is secretly ours? That's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. This was never a one-way chokehold. It's two hands on the same throat. And in November 2025, following a Trump-Xi summit, both sides agreed to a fragile one-year pause on the toughest measures, without dismantling any of the underlying legal machinery. The kill switch didn't get removed. It got set down on the table, in plain view of both players, as a reminder of what happens if talks break down again. If you were tracking the trade war's effect on the stock market that autumn, you already felt this. Chip and defense supplier equities swung violently on every headline out of Beijing and Washington, because traders finally understood that either government could, with a single memo, strand a factory that took 3 years and $3 billion to build. Drop your answer in the comments. If you found out a factory near you proudly labeled Made in America was actually running on licensed foreign technology under the hood, would that change how you feel about it? Keep that question in your back pocket. We're coming back to it, with a name and an address. Europe's quiet China pivot. 3. The growth market you're not allowed to leave. Europe's version of this story usually gets told as a clean divorce. Russia cut off the cheap pipeline gas. Germany scrambled to replace it with expensive shipped-in LNG. And European industry got permanently less competitive. All of that's true. What gets left out is what German industry did next. And it complicates the tidy, the West is decoupling from its rivals narrative more than almost anything else in this story. In March 2026, BASF, the largest chemical producer on Earth, formally opened its new Zhangjiang production complex in southern China, an investment of roughly 8.7 billion euros and the single largest capital project in the company's 160-year history. At the same time, BASF has been idling capacity and cutting jobs at its historic home base in Ludwigshafen, Germany, while reallocating close to 28% of its 2025-2028 global capital spending toward the Asia-Pacific region. And BASF isn't the outlier. The German Chamber of Commerce's most recent business confidence survey found that 93% of member companies intend to keep operating in China, with more than half planning to increase investment there over the next 2 years. So here's the uncomfortable question buried in the middle of the deglobalization story. Is German industry decoupling from a geopolitical rival, or doing the opposite in the one country that actually buys its products? The honest answer is both, depending on which part of the business you're looking at. It's a bit like breaking up with someone and still splitting a mortgage with them, because the house is worth too much to just walk away from. You stop sharing a bank account. You don't stop showing up to the property. Companies aren't leaving rivals wholesale. They're getting more selective about which parts of a rival they still need, and which parts they'd rather not depend on ever again. That's the real shape of what's happening in the geopolitics Europe now finds itself navigating. Not a clean wall going up, but a sorting process playing out in every boardroom capital allocation memo this year. Security-sensitive inputs like energy and semiconductors get walled off from rivals at almost any cost. Growth-sensitive market access businesses go exactly where the customers are, rival or not. It's not decoupling. It's triage, dressed up in press releases that only ever tell you about the wall, never about the door standing right next to it. 4. The bill nobody itemized. This is where we stop describing and start counting. If there's one policy that captures the entire subsidy arms race, the United States throwing government money at companies to build factories domestically, followed by Europe, South Korea, Japan, and China, all doing the same to avoid losing investment. It's the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, signed into law in August 2022. Nearly every macro channel covering this topic describes it the same way. Hundreds of billions of dollars. A manufacturing renaissance. Factories springing up in Ohio and Arizona and Georgia. That's the press release version. Here's the audit. According to Rhodium Group's Clean Investment Monitor, companies have announced 380 new clean technology manufacturing facilities since the IRA became law. As of the most recent full accounting at the time, only 161 of them, a little over 4 in 10, were actually operating. Sit with that ratio for a second. For every 10 factories a press secretary got to announce at a podium, roughly 6 of them exist right now, only as a rendering, a permit application, or a groundbreaking photo with a governor holding an oversized shovel. The rest sit somewhere between under construction and permanently shelved. And the direction of travel has been getting worse, not better. In the fourth quarter of 2025 alone, roughly $8 billion of previously announced manufacturing investment was formally canceled, a new quarterly record. And annual clean manufacturing investment for all of 2025 finished about 17% below 2024. Separately, the nonpartisan tracking group E2 calculated that across all of 2025, companies canceled, downsized, or closed roughly $34.8 billion in clean energy projects and more than 38,000 associated jobs, outpacing new investment by roughly $3 withdrawn for every $1 announced. In December 2025 alone, battery maker SK On pulled back $2.8 billion and 3,300 jobs in Tennessee. And Ford canceled a planned manufacturing site in Ohio. Let me know in the comments. Does a factory that breaks ground but never finishes count as reshoring? Or is a ribbon-cutting ceremony just a very expensive photo op? Now let's talk about the jobs that did get created. Because that story is just as uncomfortable, maybe more so. In 2023, the watchdog group Good Jobs First analyzed 5 of the largest subsidized battery megaprojects and calculated the true public cost per job once federal tax credits are added to state and local incentives. The number wasn't in the tens of thousands. It ranged from roughly $2 million to $7 million of public subsidy for every single job created. At the LG Honda battery plant in Jeffersonville, Ohio, that worked out to about $4.3 million per job across 2,200 positions. At Panasonic's plant in DeSoto, Kansas, taxpayers are effectively on the hook for roughly $2 million per job. Average pay across the 5 facilities came in around $46,000 a year, well under the roughly $59,000 national average for U.S. auto sector production workers. Think about what that actually means in plain, human terms. Imagine hiring a single landscaper for your yard. He quotes you $50 an hour. Sounds reasonable, you shake on it. Then the invoice arrives and it's for $2 million. That's not a landscaper anymore. That's a down payment on a mansion, with one guy occasionally mowing the lawn as a courtesy. That is roughly the unit economics of American industrial policy in the years right after the IRA passed. And nobody put that comparison on the press release either. And then there's the part that should really bother you if you actually care about the stated purpose of these programs, which was walling off Chinese industrial capacity. Ford's Blue Oval battery plant in Marshall, Michigan, was announced as a flagship of American reshoring. 2,500 jobs, $3.5 billion, built entirely on U.S. soil. It's also running on battery technology licensed directly from CATL, the Chinese company that is, by a wide margin, the largest EV battery maker on the planet. Facing political pressure over that arrangement, Ford cut the plant's production capacity by roughly 43%. And projected jobs fell from 2,500 to about 1,700. The factory is still American soil, American construction workers, American tax credits. The intellectual property running the machines inside it is Chinese, licensed, paid for, contractually ongoing. If the entire point of the subsidy arms race is decoupling from a rival's technology base, and the single most politically celebrated project of that policy is licensing its core technology from that exact rival, what precisely got decoupled? Say it out loud. It's a genuinely difficult question to answer honestly. Speaking of massive government subsidies, nobody's offering me $4 million to keep making this channel, so if you'd rather see the receipts than the ribbon cutting, hitting that subscribe button costs the algorithm nothing and helps it find people who feel the same way. Unlike a battery plant, that part's actually efficient. 5. The Vault Reshuffle. While Washington, Brussels, Seoul, and Beijing all bid against each other for factories, a quieter and arguably more consequential shift has been happening in central bank basements. A watershed moment for sovereign reserve risk landed in February 2022, when roughly $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves were frozen by sanction. Finance ministries around the world absorbed an unmistakable lesson. Dollar-denominated reserves can be switched off by a keystroke if you end up on the wrong side of a dispute. Gold, sitting in a vault inside your own borders, cannot be frozen by a phone call from Washington or Brussels. According to the World Gold Council, central banks bought a net 863 tons of gold in 2025, down from the record pace of the prior 3 years, but still nearly double the 2010-2021 annual average of around 473 tons. China's central bank has reported gold reserve additions for 14 consecutive months. This is what de-dollarization actually looks like in practice. Not a dramatic currency swap covered breathlessly on the evening news, but a slow, deliberate accumulation of an asset that isn't anyone else's liability, running quietly in the background of everything else happening in geopolitics and money right now. Ask yourself, if you ran a central bank that had just watched a rival's $300 billion disappear behind a legal memo, what would you be buying too? The dollar isn't dying next quarter. Let's be clear about that, because the dramatic version of this story is usually wrong. But the assumption that everyone needs to hold it, unconditionally, forever, no questions asked, is quietly being tested by exactly the countries with the most reserves left to lose. 3 more fractures to watch. 6. The fractures we don't have time to autopsy in full, but you need on your radar. China's population fell for a 4th consecutive year in 2025, down by 3.39 million people to roughly 1.405 billion. With births falling to just 7.92 million, the lowest figure in decades according to China's National Bureau of Statistics. That's not a crisis that resolves itself with one good policy year. It's a structural shift in how much cheap labor the global economy has access to going forward, and the pattern extends well beyond China, into South Korea, Japan, and much of Eastern Europe. Fewer young workers eventually means more expensive workers, and more expensive workers means the cheap factory somewhere. Assumption that built the last 30 years quietly runs out of places to hide. Then there's the green wall, carbon border taxes led by the European Union. That tax, dirty, imports at the border, officially for climate reasons, functionally as industrial protection for European manufacturers who already pay to offset their own emissions and would otherwise get undercut by producers who don't. It's climate policy and trade policy occupying the exact same legal document, and pretending those two motives can be neatly separated is naive. Developing economies see it plainly for what it is, a tariff wearing a lab coat. And there's the splinter net, where data localization laws, national firewalls, and outright platform bans mean a company can no longer build one product and ship it to the whole planet the way it could a decade ago. Launching one product worldwide now effectively means maintaining 3 incompatible products. One built for US rules, one re-engineered to satisfy European data law, and assuming regulators even grant entry, a third rebuilt from the ground up to clear Chinese approval. That's not a rounding error in a budget. It's roughly triple the engineering headcount required to reach the same global user base that a single unified build used to reach for the price of one. Every one of these is its own full video. Today, they're context for the same underlying pattern running through everything we've covered. Friction, walls, and fragmentation, quietly replacing 30 years of frictionless flow, one policy memo at a time. So, final thoughts. Quick disclaimer before we land the plane. This is analysis, not financial advice, so treat it as a starting point for your own research. not a recommendation. Add all 6 of these fractures together and you get one word: inflation. Not the temporary, transitory kind central banks kept promising a few years ago. A structural kind, because every fracture we just walked through makes things more expensive by design, not by accident. Redundant factories cost more than one efficient one. Friendly suppliers cost more than the cheapest supplier. Gold sitting idle in a vault earns nothing, which is precisely the point of holding it. Security, it turns out, has never been free. For 30 years, the rest of the world quietly paid that premium on our behalf, hidden inside cheap labor costs we never had to think about. Now we're paying it ourselves, out loud on every receipt. If this feels unprecedented, it isn't. And that's oddly the more useful way to think about it. In June 1930, with the Great Depression already underway, the United States passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, raising duties on more than 20,000 imported goods and pushing average tariff rates on dutiable items from roughly 40% up towards 60%. More than 24 countries retaliated with tariffs of their own. And within about 4 years, global trade had collapsed by roughly 65%. The stated intent was to protect American jobs. The actual result was a world that got poorer, angrier, and considerably more dangerous. Together, at almost exactly the same time. That's the pattern sitting underneath every empire in decline. Going back centuries, when a dominant power feels its position slipping, it reaches for control instead of efficiency, and the rest of the world reaches back, harder than expected. It's less a conspiracy than a reflex. But reflexes, run often enough throughout the history of economic crisis, are exactly how empires learn where their limits actually are, which is really what a story about geopolitics and empire always comes down to. Once you strip away the spreadsheets and read the shipping manifests for what they are. Is it hopeless? No. Reshoring, done honestly and audited properly rather than announced once and forgotten, does build real capacity somewhere, eventually, for someone. Central banks diversifying isn't collapse. It's insurance, and insurance is usually a sign of a system behaving rationally, not one falling apart. But if you're waiting for prices to drift back down to 2015 levels once supply chains normalize, stop waiting. There is no version of the global economy of 2026 where the old discount quietly comes back. The bill is the new baseline, and pretending otherwise is how you end up genuinely surprised, again at the checkout line. If this autopsy helped you see past the press releases, do 2 things. Hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that people would rather see verified numbers than groundbreaking ceremony photos, which is apparently a rare enough preference that it needs a little help finding its audience. And subscribe, because next up we're running this exact same audit on Europe's answer to the IRA, the Critical Raw Materials Act, to see whether Brussels is getting a better return on its money than Washington did, or just losing more slowly and calling it strategy. Until then, keep the receipts. Question the ribbon cuttings, and I'll catch you in the next one.